Leadership Klamath. And so this will not be news to him. He's experienced. But we're going to take them so we can keep it as part of our oral history program. So I've asked him to start by giving us just a little bit of personal background that he doesn't always put into his presentation. So, after all, he has to show why he's qualified to give this talk. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I had them put away the podium because it kind of bothers me, but if you can't hear me, I'll jerk that out and we'll put the microphone in there. How about hold it?
You can just carry the microphone if you want.
Let's swing the microphone around. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My talk will be on the coming of the railroad to Klamath Falls in May of 1909 and the early history of Midland. Now, Midland was on the map because of the railroad. It was the second largest shipping point in Oregon. Now, my talk, a lot of the oral history was passed down to me from the late Jim Flowers and Winston Patterson. We all grew up in Midland, and this was all passed down to me. What I didn't absorb was passed down, so I kind of know what I'm talking about. So since the railroad is the important instrument that started it, let us reflect a little bit on that. In the California Eastern Railroad, operating on a weed, made the decision in 1909 to push on up into the Klamath Basin and eventuly on up into the Willamette Valley. By 1905, they had pushed around the west end of Mount Shasta, and by 1906 they were in Grass Lake. Now Grass Lake is that little wayside on Highway 97, 30 miles this side of Weed. And there they began to have an impact on Klamath Falls. Stagecoaches were making daily runs from the Grass Lake to Laird's Landing. Laird's Landing was the steamboat dock. People would catch the steamboat there, come on up through Lower Klamath Lake, through the Straits of Drain, and on into Klamath Falls and docking somewhere around where the hotel is down there now. Now they would make, well, from 1906 they pressed on up into McDowell, and there they were in the path of the migration of all the cattle that were shipped out of Grenada and Montague. Cattle were shipped were driven all the way from Paisley and from Upper Klamath Lake and from Alturas, and they came through that area. So the railroad had an opportunity. They built a corral there and they had a dining hall there, and one report shows that they put out 300 head of cattle in one day there. That's quite a bit. The engine would stay there and move the cars up for them, and they would load the cars in this one chute, and when they had those cars loaded, the train took off and it had precedent over all the freight lines and the passengers, because they had to stop every 24 hours and water and feed those cattle, and they didn't like that. So, but at McDowell, there was a change of ownership. Henry Harriman, the big four railroad tycoons, bought the railroad, and from then on it was called SP Railroad. Harriman and his two sons, Averill and Roland, came to Klamath Falls from McDowell, and they caught the steamboat at Teeter's Landing. That's over on the Keno Highway, and they were amazed at how modern equipment it was in this vast outland. His two boys roamed around all up into the Heavenly Twins area and all the Skyline Lakes and all that, and they dubbed it the Switzerland of the West. It pushed on the railroad, and it made two tunnels, one at Doris, and then there's another tunnel back up in the hills there, and it made it to 80 by December of 1908. And there they had the bridge across the straits, and then they had to build a dike up, the road bed up across the north end of the Lower Klamath Lake. Two big drag lines were assembled, one down at Teeter's Landing, and it was to go up the west side of the road and have a navigable ditch on the west side of the railroad. Two small drag lines were operating on the east side of the railroad, and by March of 1909, they had reached Midland. And of course, back at the straits, they had bridged the Straits Drain. Now the Straits Drain, I'll explain a little bit about that. It's a natural drain that runs from Lower Klamath Lake into the river. And it doesn't quite drain all of Lower Klamath Lake. There's all lake bed there is lower than that. But the ice jams and a lot of water in the spring of the year jam up down at Keno. The water would rush back into Lower Klamath Lake and then back out. So it dug a real natural drain there, about 75 yards wide and about 20 feet deep. So they put the bridge in there, and at the same time the reclamation made a contract with the railroad that they would put head gates in there, but they didn't do it at that time. They came back later and did it. So they reached Midland, the high ground, in March of 1909. From there on, it was all done by Fresno and horses and teams. And old man Hooper had a livery stable up about across from that service station, or that one motel that's there. And he housed 100 head of horses and took care of those horses, all for the grading up of the railroad. And at one time they had 300 men working on that cut that was out there by Texan, what we call Texan. It's out by that Roundhouse Hill. And they got that done. J. Frank Adams had dredged the dike up across Lake Ewana, so that was all settled and done. By May the 3rd of 1909, a work train reached Klamath Falls. And from then on, it was just a matter of filling it in. And so they had the day set for May the 20th of 1909 for the big day that the train was going to come in. That morning, 85 people left the Baldwin Hotel down there and went down to 80, and they had sack lunches and everything, and they waited there for the train to come in. Train come in, and it was all gaily decorated, and they had a band on it. They were the first to come to Klamath Falls on the train. The train took off at about 12:15, and took 38 minutes to come on up into Klamath Falls. Imagine going across that old soupy railroad bed. They were kind of wobbly by the time they got up there, but it settled and everything. Now it reached Klamath Falls around a little over around 1 o'clock. Klamath Falls closed down. Everyone who was anyone was there. That was the biggest day in the history, and ever will be, for Klamath Falls. It opened it up to the rest of the world. In could come all heavy equipment, and out could go lumber and grain and everything. It was a great day for Klamath Falls. And pictures show that there were about 12, 14 cars. No, not 12, 14, but at least about 8 cars in the picture there that day. How they got to Klamath Falls, I don't know, but the Model Ts were great automobiles. Now, let us reflect back to Midland. They picked Midland because it was a wide open place there at that time, nothing but sagebrush, and they needed that for the corrals. And the SP Railroad had put up 4 corrals there, 4 pens for corrals, and a loading chute. They had to drill the well and put a tower up there to water the cows in. They also had 2 section cabins across the railroad, and the section boss had a 2-story building there. They also put the depot in down about where that spud cellar is, at the south end of that spud cellar. Then some people by the name of Barks built some corrals across the road from where the SP Railroad corrals are. And in fact, it's right where that rest area is. And later that was operated by Harry Witherell. He had a scale there, and the railroad didn't have a scale, so he ran a lot of stuff through the scale there. Then there was another corral about 3/4 of a mile east of Midland. And there was a spring there, and they watered their cattle in that spring. That spring was known as Spring Lake. Now, Midland didn't grow too much. In 1909, there was a store built at about where the intersection is there in Midland, on the south side of that, where the road leads up to the other subdivision up there. It was built right there, and it was called the Green Store, or at least we dubbed it the Green Store, because the sides were made out of flooring, and they were painted an apple green. So in the great big windows, and you could look in there and see this apple green. So we all dubbed that the Green Store. It didn't flourish too much. There was another store built about 1912 over on a street paralleling the road that goes east from Klamath Falls. That was Main Street. They had it figured that Main Street, that the road would come in and it'd come in on Main Street. The plat for Midland was platted about 1906. It was never incorporated. The state of Midland was never incorporated. So on the Main Street, there was a hotel built there in 1906, and about 11 rooms is all it had. And then there was the Midland store in 1912, and in 1915 the post office was in the Midland store. The schoolhouse was about a mile, or about a 1/4 mile from that intersection there, and right now there's a lot of green roof buildings to the right back in there. When you go into that, if you go into that house there, where the green roofs are, you're crossing right over the middle of the schoolhouse. So, and it was right along the road. As I said before, it didn't grow too much. There were only a very few houses there. There was the one that Abel 80 built, and it was a deluxe house. He was the surveyor for the road came through. He got the inside dope on what it was coming from, and he bought the property and surveyed it, and he tacked a price on it. They got about the price, but they figured that they didn't have time to take him through court, so they paid him. He built a house up on the hill there, plastered out, laughing plastered, one of the nicest houses. But he died at the age of 45 and was buried down in Merrill, so he didn't get in too much of his place. Well, the cattle. Now the cattle came from as far away as the ZX Ranch over Paisley, and they were driven down to Midland. Not all of them at one time. They had to pasture some up in Lanza Valley and then out at Olean, and then slowly but surely, because you couldn't get cars to ship it out at the same time. But they shipped out lots of cattle. The hotel only had, I think it was, I said 11 rooms, but I think it was only 9, and it was all taken up by the cattle buyers and the brand inspectors and all the dignitaries that go around with cattle. So the cowboys, they all stuck with their chuck wagon and their tents and stuff, and they ate once in a while in the hotel. Edna Flowers, her name was Edna Flowers, mother of George, Jim, and Francis Flowers. She bought the hotel and the store, and of course she was accorded the post office in about 1924. She's fed as many as 40 cowboys in one day at the hotel. So it was a real booming place. Well, the school was built in 1909, and it began this fall of 1909 with about 14 students. I think your sister was one of the teachers at one time, I remember, Ellis?
Yes, in 28, 29.
28, 29. At some time, and I never found out just exactly when, the second room was built on, but when I came there in 1930, it was just used in one room. And it was, the last time it was used was in 1933. It was moved on up to Alabama. Now, the head gates were put in down at the Straits, and that was the source of water that kept Lower Klamath Lake flooded. And so they closed the head gates in 1916, so that cut off the water, and a lot of land was for sale. The Chinese, the name of, let me get this one. Cheng Lung and Sing Ki, two wealthy Chinese men from San Francisco, and they came up and got 3,200 acres of ground right straight south of Midland and all the way down to the Straits Drain. Their bookkeeper was Sam Wong, or Wong that's out on Merrill Road. Now at the same time there was some Japanese just at the west, and his name was A.T. Amaguchi. And he had about 800 acres and worked with a 40 best tractor. Amaguchi, and I have a feeling they came from the San Francisco area, and I have a hunch that our Christy Amaguchi, the world champion ice skater, is some relative of that. Then south of that, there was another Chinese, and that was Japanese. And south of that, there was another one. Now let me get this one. Yamashita. And he farmed down below the Straits Drain there. He had two big old Best tractors, 75 horse Best tractors, and he sold in 1920 to Zuckerman's, and they operated it. My uncle was foreman of the ranch there at that time in 1929, and my sister and I would have to go down there and visit our aunt, stay a week, on that lonesome island out there. And I can remember those two big old tractors. Well, back up here to Ching Lung and Sing Ki, they rented a hotel at Midland for their crew. They had 3,200 acres there, and they operated with big old Best tractors. They come from the Stockton area. Their headquarters were in San Francisco. Everything was going fine. They were raising some crops. The method of raising crops had not been established too much there in that Lower Klamath Lake, so the crops were not too good. But anyway, they stayed in there, and on September the 8th, 1922, they went up to the bunkhouse to eat lunch, and a fire broke out and just burned up everything, their old Harris tractor or Harris combine, and just scattered around. They had 20 men working on it, and Mike Motzenbecker brought in a tractor and plowed around it, and they got it corralled by Sunday night. This was Friday, and they got it corralled by Sunday night. So everything looked good. Then Monday morning, there was a nice breeze blowing, and all these ashes and stuff that were embedded in the peat moss and stuff that grew, it whipped up this breeze, and huge whirlwinds would pick up this gas and stuff that was created by the ones that were burning down in the peat moss, and pick it up in the air and take it up, and then it would be touched off by some other whirlwind, and big sonic booms would boom. The Klamath News said that those booms, or sonic booms we call them, were heard as far away as Crater Lake. It took me a long time to figure that one out, how the sonic booms come about. They did. Anyway, this put the Chinese out of business. The Chinaman sold to someone, and eventually it wound up into the Federal Land Bank of Stockton. And the Chinaman, or the Japanese, sold to San Joaquin Realty Company, and the man south of there sold to Zuckerman's. The Lung Ranch changed hands several times. It was sold once to a fellow by the name of Letcher Holbrook. He was a sheepman from Midland. They're dead of the Depression, and things didn't turn out well, and he lost it back to the Federal Land Bank. I met him after the war out at the Pelican School one day, and he said he lost $85,000 in that ranch down there, and he wished he had never seen an inch of Lower Klamath Lake. I had just acquired a lease. Lease land had all my life's earnings or military savings in a lease a little further south of that. So that was good news. Anyway, in 1936, a fellow by the name of H. Patterson, a car salesman from, I think it was Oakland, came up there, and his brother-in-law was the manager of the Federal Land Bank of Stockton. So they made up some kind of a deal where they'd buy it, and so he operated. He wasn't too much of a farmer, but he had a wonderful tractor. He had an Atlas Imperial tractor, put in an old gas 60 operated cat, and it would pull anything that you could hook on behind it. Well, things weren't too good with him, but then he stayed in there. And out in front of his ranch, about, out in the middle of the field there was a spring, and it kept about 6 or 8 acres there, just soggy all the time, never really running anywhere. And he found that the California Oregon Power Company and the Reclamation made up a contract that within 30 miles of Merrill, if anyone put in a drainage pump, that the power company was supposed to bring electricity to it. So he put in a pump out there, about a 2 horse pump, and they had to bring electricity to that. That's the only way Midland got electricity that soon. Telephones didn't come until after Truman made the well, he induced all of the utilities to expand, and that they would loan the money to do so. So that's when telephones come, in 1950 or 51, somewhere along in there. And it would not have been for Patterson that electricity would not come to Midland at that time. Now we've covered the cattle shipping. Let's get back to the roads. As I said, Midland was platted in 1906, and the road came from the east into Midland. And instead of coming over on Main Street, it came around another street south of Main Street. That put the Midland service station, or the Midland store, and it did have a gas pump there, and a hotel and all that, put them off the road. Well, it didn't make any difference because the road only stopped down at the end of the corrals, at the end of Lower Klamath Lake. But in April of 1923, the Klamath Drainage District bought a drag line from Stockton somewhere, and they sent Ole Travers up to put it together and teach people how to work it. So Frank Gray was the one that was taught how to run the drag line. They made a ditch from Midland all the way to Warden, both sides of the straight drain, and Frank Gray was the operator, and the bank was pushed up on the west side, and that was graded down, pushed down, and you could go across with automobiles. In 1925, they bought some property off of the Wild Horse Butte down there, off of Edna Flowers, and they put the bedrock on the road across the swamp at that time, and then they put red cinders on it from the pit back of Warden there. So in 1935, actually, you could drive all the way across there, and that was 1925. You could go all the way across, and that was the Dallas, California highway then. Then next, in 1935, there used to be a big old turn. You'd come from the east and then you'd turn south. And on that curve, it was supered and all that, but on New Year's night of 1935, there were 8 wrecks piled in that. Of course, Calor was underway at that time. And 4 people drowned in the canal on the way up, and 2 people were killed on the Doris Hill. Well, anyway, the road straightened up and come alongside the railroad all the way up to a few mile or so from the Plymouth River, built a good bridge across that, eventually wound up down here by the Baldwin Hotel. So, and that was blacktop in 1936. Well, here's the Midland store over here, moved once over to the highway and then planned to move again, so it moved again over to where it is now, except that that particular store burnt and another one was built there in the same place, and hotel, or the post office is there now too, in the store. It's not much of a store now, just a little convenience store. So all the Midland consists of today, then, at the beginning of the World War II, there were fewer than 12 houses in Midland, in the vicinity of Midland. And there was only the post office and the little store. It had a little more than just groceries there. It had some groceries there, but it did sell gas. Then after the war, during the war, at about that time, the railroad was built from Texas out here all the way down through Merrill and on into Tule Lake. You don't have to see it. Then the Great Northern Railroad built another railroad down to Merrill and to Midland, and then across to south of Tule Lake and on down to Alturas. Then the Strayhorn Railroad, which somebody calls it the OC&E Railroad, built a railroad up into Bly, and the SP pushed on up into Kirk, but not much further. So all of those took away the cattle business, and then modern transportation and everything. So Midland just kind of dried up. One thing I didn't mention was that the Martin brothers built a warehouse in 1913 down there, right west of the railroad, and the building is still there today. There's only 2 buildings left of the old Midland bunch. That big warehouse is still there, and then the green roofed house where I grew up, a quarter mile east of the intersection there. So when I went to the service, Midland was on its bottom. It just no place else to go but up. So after the war, the store was sold many times and wound up into Clark Leach. He had a son named Everett Leach, and Everett took up carpentry and learned to be a carpenter. One day he built a house on Main Street for sale. The bank told him that wouldn't sell. It did. He sold and built 17 more houses along there. And the biggest asset that he did for Midland was he subdivided a piece, 40 or 50 acres, right east of where the rest area is now. And he built 32 houses in there. All of them are blacktop, and they have a lot of ornamental trees. People take pride in their lawns, keeping nice lawns, and when you go up in there in the spring of the year, you might think you were in Shangri-La. Makes you proud to say, I grew up in Midland. Thank you.
Come back for a minute and let us ask questions, okay?
Oh, certainly, certainly.
What did your father do?
Well, my father came there and farmed a little bit on the Holbrook Ranch, and then he broke his leg and not much done. And Eventually went back up into Swan Lake, but we lived there at Midland because we lived between, well, right next to the schoolhouse. My mother wasn't about to haul us kids anymore to school. And, well, it more or less went broke, and during the war, he went to work in a sawmill at Doris. And after the war, he and I formed a partnership and farmed down on North Lima Lake. Veterans were given preference on leases, and I had saved some money during the war, and we got some of the leases, and eventually I got a wildlife lease, and more and more and more, till you're free. Okay,
Would you tell us a little bit about the grain shipments
the grain.
that shipped out of Midland?
Oh, well, prior to any outlet, if you grew grain, you know, had to sell it, and your neighbors or whatever could be consumed locally. That's about all there was, so there wasn't too incentive to grow a lot of grain. Well, Martin Brothers put this warehouse in down there, and if you had 2 or 3 tons of grain, you could bring it up there, and it is said that old Charlie Martin had a price on it, and he would get a price, and you would sell him 10, 15 ton or so, and somebody else 10, 15 tons, until he got enough to ship a carload out. And it would come from Merrill, Malin, Bonanza, Bly, and up on Upper Congress Lake. It was a real deal. Okay?
Martin Brothers had a flour mill on the corner of Spring Street and on the viaduct, actually. It's all vacant now. I think there's a little restaurant there, but there was a huge flour mill there
Yeah.
until recently.
Uh,
Well, I mean, the building. They're long gone.
It burnt down about,
It's about across from the,
20 years ago. It was right at the foot of the viaduct.
well, it was inside, well, actually, it was across from the, you want a box?
You want to block, yeah.
Yeah, and it's Spring Street and Sixth is what it was.
Well, the
And
viaduct,
then they put the viaduct over and
Yeah.
that kind of messed things up.
yes, and they had a little old chute. Grain was put in sacks in those days because there was no way of handling it to put any out.
You could get flour there, actually, you know, right?
You know, Martin Brothers flour and the Golden Harvest flour, Anchor flour. They started out with a flour mill in Maryland in 1904. And Charlie Martin and John Martin, I believe is what it was. John was the playboy.
Yeah.
He rode around in a LaSalle automobile. Okay.
Did you live on the place where you live now?
No,
You got that later.
no. I don't know, I bought that about 1950. And then we put the house there in 1957. And that makes Irene and I neighbors. Okay?
What did the Chinese grow on there, you know, down there on there?
I'm not sure, but it wouldn't be too much rye and oats and barley. Rye didn't do too good, but oats and barley seemed to be the crop that prevailed there afterwards. Oats was exceptionally good.
That burning peat came up here,
Yes.
and I wore long black stockings, you know, like kids did too, and itch, my golly, we itched. It was awful. Every once in a while, we'd get the whole town just be a pall of,
Yeah, I lived up on Jefferson Street and that peat smoke and ash would come clear up in town.
Now, there's the nettles, and they make a mound of nettles, and they'll grow and grow, and the roots will die and die. And the little hair-like deals that are on the nettles will get up in the fire and in the ashes, and that's what makes you itch.
I think I remember hearing somewhere that they didn't ship any barley out of Midland during the early 30s.
Didn't keep any barley?
They didn't ship any out. I guess they used it locally, the barley.
Well, I don't know, there wasn't much feeding going on. Barley has been the feed crop. But I would say in 1930 they shipped it out, there's no question about it.
I thought they used it
Isn't
to.
Verland also a thing you use in beer and that was
Yeah.
prohibition?
Didn't they use
That would've
it
been
locally
good.
for prohibition, during prohibition time?
Oh,
There was some pretty active.
most of the moonshining was done with rye.
Oh, I see, I had to.
Jim Flowers could tell.
This moonshining. I told some of the people in the Historical Society, I knew where there was a still down down below the very end of Lower Klamath Lake. And they kept talking to me about going up there, and I said, well, I says, if you get 10 people, I'll take you down to where the still is. Well, on one August day, a day that it seldom rains, it was just raining cats and dogs. And about 5 o'clock, I thought, well, gee, then nobody will show up. But I went down to the state line where we were supposed to meet, and here was 10 cars. And Historical Society people, some of you people were on that. And we went around and got to the bottom of this hill where the still was, and I didn't tell them the still was up there. And the rock is kind of jacked, and well, it's sort of pumice-like, only it looks like rock. So I took an axe and I chopped on the rocks and everything, and showed them they were all out of it. Now I said, the still is up there under that tree. And boy, you talk about a bunch of sheep going up that hill. Okay.
Was it there? Was it there?
What?
Was it there?
Was it good?
Was it there, the still?
Oh, the still was, actually it was cut through into the hillside. And there was quite a room in there. And of course the door was still on there, but long, long before that the still was gone.
Oh, I see.
This was only about 10 years ago. You were with that, Dad? There was one that went up there.
Taxi drivers.
Yes, there was no stove, and then there was cracks up through the rock, and they put chimneys up through that.
Before we moved.
So it was a real still, and
There's bars on the basement windows.
they had a hose that ran from wherever they sipped it and down into the road, and guys could fill up their whiskey jug out there and not be exposed to silt. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.